want to begin by thanking you and the Institute for Jewish Ethics for hosting this timely topic today, and for the opportunity to moderate what I think should be a really interesting discussion, and of course with really interesting speakers. Our topic, as people know, is dignity on death row, what one man's death row story reveals about punishment, human value, and the soul of our justice system. That particular story is really the story of Scott Dozier, and it's told in Gianna's recently published book, The Volunteer, The Failure of the Death Penalty in America, and One Inmate's Quest to Die with Dignity. The book went on sale this past April, highly recommended. It's a very interesting read. Gianna herself is an Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker. She, as was noted, has been a guest on the Just Pod, the podcast that I'm privileged to host along with my friend Gennard Butler for the American Bar Association. Gianna, it's great to see you again. Welcome to not the Just Pod, but to the Institute for Jewish Ethics this time.
Well, thank you so much, Justin, and I'm so grateful to the Institute and Rabbi Alexander Coleman and the whole team for having me. I'm really grateful and thrilled to be here.
Well, it's great to have the discussion with you, and to begin with you before we turn to Rabbi Breitowitz a little later, who I'll introduce at that time, and also thrilled to have joining us. Gianna, to begin with you, though, volunteers, as you know, has a particular meaning in the death penalty community. And what it refers to is, interestingly, the people who are on death row, the inmates who have been sentenced to death and who elect to be sentenced to death. I'm sure given other options, they choose other options, but they are actually seeking the imposition of the death penalty. The title of your book, as I noticed, is The Volunteer. And so to get us started, what I thought might be interesting is for you to just lay the background with the story at a high level, summary fashion, of Scott Dozier, who himself was a volunteer. I think there's a simplistic public perception that you have the abolitionists, the opponents of the death penalty, and you have the proponents of the death penalty. Volunteers come along and sort of complicate the picture by essentially saying, you sentenced me, now carry out your sentence. But Gianna, if you could just give us a little bit of background about Mr. Dozier, how you came to know him, your work in putting together the really interesting book that you've written, and we'll take the discussion from there.
Thanks so much, Justin. I originally met Scott Dozier in October of 2017. I had been working for a documentary program called Vice on HBO, where we traveled the world and told what we felt were the most pressing issues globally in 15 to 60-minute documentaries. Well, after 5 seasons, we had never covered the death penalty, and so I pitched it, and the response was, if you can get an interview in person, on camera, with a death row inmate, then the story is greenlit. And so it was a very high bar to entry. And frankly, I was looking for somebody who was a little bit more sympathetic than Scott Dozier. But because of some arbitrary policies within prison systems around the country, Scott Dozier was the person who responded and who said, sure, I'll do an interview. Now, what I found interesting, after some time was that Scott Dozier was not a sort of innocence project kind of story. He wasn't pleading his innocence. And frankly, he didn't have the best case for it. I mean, his cases didn't have DNA evidence, which didn't make them very strong. They were all based on circumstantial evidence, but it wasn't like, he was Richard Glossop, for instance. And so I thought that was interesting. And the second part I found interesting was that he was a volunteer, as you said. And so only 10% of death row inmates volunteer for execution. And so, in 2016, he wrote the judge a letter and he said, okay, you sentenced me to death. I'd like for you to waive my right to appeal, and I'd like for you to carry out the death sentence. And so then the state had, what many wouldn't think would be an extraordinary challenge, but what ended up being an extraordinary challenge, which was that they had to find a way to execute him. And in America, many might know that can actually be pretty hard because it is a challenge to get access to the drugs. I'm sure we'll talk about more of that later, but what ended up happening was that Dozier was quite literally fighting to be executed, and the state couldn't find a way to carry it out. And I found that challenge to be a really kind of interesting representation of how broken this death penalty system is in America. And so once Scott Dozier, once he died, I kept thinking about his story, and I really wanted the time and space to investigate it further, to better understand how his story and the weeks leading to his death and then his eventual death, what the version of that story it was from the state side. I wanted their emails, I wanted the medical records, I wanted the internal memos. And so I ended up spending, more than a year digging deep into his story, and it really, presented many revelations which made their way into the book.
And Gianna, I don't know if you want to give away this much of the book, but do you want to just explain how he came to die? It
Sure.
might surprise people.
Sure. So his first execution was stayed, then his second execution was stayed. And after that second execution was stayed, the prison put Scott into what is effectively solitary confinement. Now, they called it suicide watch at first and this is sort of strange, but this is common in states where they will put somebody on death row in suicide watch before and sometimes after a failed execution to ensure that they do not take their own life, even though the purported goal is for the person to die. I guess they want the state to have the honor of doing it. I'm unclear on why that's such a concern for them if they have a shared goal. Anyway, they put him into solitary confinement and then into mental health observation, which is, again, basically solitary confinement, which I describe in detail in the book what exactly the conditions were, but he didn't have access to basically anything. Um, and and then, some time passed and he was put into this mental health observation again. And in the weeks leading up to his death, he, after 3.5 weeks in solitary, was really changing as a person. I mean, he had degraded incredibly. And I talked to him the day he was put into solitary. Then he didn't have access to the phone, with the exception of one time it was slipped to him by a guard. And so he called me one time in the middle. And then, of course, I talked to him after those 3.5 weeks, and he had changed. I mean, it had really weighed on him. It had degraded him mentally, emotionally, physically, even. I mean, he was losing muscle mass. He was kind of destroyed. And he told me in the weeks leading up to his death that he would not have degraded mentally. His mental health was in a great place before solitary, and it was the state putting him into solitary that made him suicidal. And so what he tells me in the weeks before his death is the state's way of treating me is leading me toward suicide. And then eventually he does take his own life. And there was no question for me why he took his own life. It wasn't because he was in prison. It wasn't because he was sentenced to death. It wasn't because of, a chemical imbalance that had been chronic. It was because he feared being put into solitary confinement again and having to be there for a long period of time. And that fear was enough to put him over the edge. And the reason I know that is because he told me that. He told me that before he killed himself.
Really interesting. So around the time of the publication of The Volunteer earlier this year, you were interviewed by the LA Book Review, the Los Angeles Book Review. And one of the questions they had for you was whether your view of the death penalty had changed in any degree after writing the book. And I thought what you had to say about that was really interesting. And I'm going to quote. What you told the Los Angeles Book Review was, quote, "I grapple with this question throughout the book. It's always been easy for me to say I'm anti-death penalty. But in meeting Dozier, I felt that he should have the opportunity to activate the death sentence the state had issued him. Separately, I also started to think about victims' families, specifically parents who have lost their children to murder, and to really put myself in their shoes. What would I do? It complicated my hardline view of the practice." So I want to ask you, Gianna, as I started off with in the beginning, the purest death penalty opponents seek abolition under all circumstances, want to avoid the state engaging in this practice under any circumstances. Um, what was it about your research and Dozier's specific case, your interviews with him, your interactions, even as an opponent of the death penalty yourself, that sort of came to identify with his request to have the penalty implemented?
Well, I think, Justin, and first I'll just say, in the prologue, I'm very clear about, this book is not anti-death penalty or pro-death penalty. It's a deep investigation into a broken system. And one of the things I try to do with this book is shake people out of their comfort zones, because I think we all get very comfortable in our positions and we live in bubbles that are echo chambers and we don't consider other points of view and really step into other people's shoes. So I tried very hard to do that. I think, where I may have shifted a little bit on my views is I saw the way he was being treated, up close. And I really felt like he was being tortured by the government day in and day out by living in solitary. And at some point, I had to ask myself, would execution actually be more humane than a life in solitary confinement? And I thought about what I would choose if I were in that position. And frankly, I probably would choose execution. And I think this is, a bigger statement on our criminal justice system and the way that we treat and house our own. And so I think that was kind of the main thing, is that, if someone is being subjected to solitary confinement, or is at risk of that, and they decide that they would rather call it quits than risk that for the rest of their lives. I really did come to take Dozier's argument, and I felt that he was owed that option because the state had sentenced him to death. Now, having said that, this book in great detail outlines how broken this system is, how ineffective it is, how cruel it is. And so I would not say that I'm a proponent of the death penalty by any means. I mean, I think this system is way too broken to be carried out in any kind of moral or ethical or frankly even legal way in our country. And I know that those two arguments are at odds with one another. But I think that just underscores how complicated this book is. This is not a black and white issue. I think this is a very complicated issue that, oftentimes lives in the gray area.
Oh, that's fair. Is part of the problem, Gianna, do you think the delay, the fact that the penalty is not executed immediately, sort of instantaneously? This is something I want to get to a little bit later with Rabbi Breitowitz, because my impression is, but I'm sure he'll correct me, is that in the Jewish legal system, the death penalty, if it was executed, and it was very rarely executed, I'm sure we'll hear about, would have been done immediately. And so there would never be an issue of a period of solitary confinement, or for that matter, I think even a period of appeal. So do you think that the delay is in itself sort of adding to the punishment beyond what's been ordered by the court in an execution?
Again, this is one of those really complicated answers. I think it's a really important point you brought up, because the delay, right, we're subjecting people to this sort of like you're watching your fate, you're fearing your fate, for years, if not decades, and it most of the time it is decades, before you're actually, walking the plank. But here's the thing. We have to give people access to that appeals system, the lengthy federal appeals process, because it turns out that we aren't very good at prosecuting these cases, which is to say 49.9% of people sentenced to death in our country will have their cases overturned. Nearly 50% of death sentences will be overturned. I mean, that is an extraordinary number in my mind. Only 15%, only 15% of people ever sentenced to death will be executed. Okay, so I think we have to ask ourselves, we're sentencing all these people to death. We're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, per death sentence, and then never actually carrying it out. And so I think those delays are, I think yes, I think it's inhumane, but I think it's also incredibly important because of how poorly these cases are to begin with. Now, look, if we had 100% success rate and wrongfully convicted people were not put on death row, then I'd say I might have a different answer. But we're not good enough to withhold that appeals process. It is an incredibly important process, and the fact of the matter is that it takes time.
Sure. Along the lines of the toll that this takes, um, the collateral consequences of the death penalty, the impact on the bystanders to the death penalty. So obviously the families of the victims, right? The families of the executed. The impact that it has on the executioners themselves, which is something you and I have spoken about before. What have you learned through your reporting about the ripple effects of the implementation of the death penalty on these various other constituencies?
I'm really glad you brought that up, Justin, because I think that there's a lot of attention paid to the incarcerated, to the victims' families, and not so much to the executioners or those working for the state who touch this practice in any way. And what we're starting to learn from, research just in the last few years and from, folks now coming forward and talking about this, which has been taboo for many years, is that those people are traumatized by this experience. And you don't have to be the person pulling the trigger or flipping the switch to feel that trauma. We're talking about spiritual advisors who are sitting at the feet of, the so-called condemned and watching them die. We're talking about, wardens and assistant staff. These experiences weigh on them, even if they don't in the moment. I'll give you one example. There was a man named Ron McDaniels who was the warden of Florida State Penitentiary, where death row is. And he was warden at a time where he oversaw dozens of executions, 89, I think was the number. And he became an alcoholic. He said that he would fall asleep at night, and the men who he had executed would come into his room right when he fell asleep. He was dreaming. They would walk into his room and they would sit at the foot of his bed and they would look at him. And they wouldn't say anything. They would just look at him. And they didn't have to say anything, he said, because he knew what they were thinking. So we're talking about serious PTSD for a lot of these folks. And, the issue is that they don't experience it always in the moment. I think we have a way as humans to kind of desensitize ourselves or just do what we're told and do what we're told and do what we're told and do what we're told. And then you're 5 years in and you've been a part of, 30 executions. And then you don't get help and you start abusing substances or whatever it is, self-medicating. And then that trauma is imprinted in your brain, right? And then all these folks have a problem. A lot of these people are young and they're young parents, and they have partners and they have kids. And so it's not just the trauma they're experiencing, right? Who are they sharing, that trauma with? How are they acting? How is their behavior impacting those around them? So I think, the ripple effects are immeasurable. And I think we don't yet know the extent of how these executions are really impacting, in a very serious way, the folks who have a hand in it.
Gianna, I remember speaking with you on our prior conversation about Ron McAndrew, the former Florida prison warden, who was the head of the execution team. He's, funny enough, somebody who I interviewed on the Joss pod as well. And I very vividly remember him talking about these condemned individuals sitting at the foot of his bed as he was going to sleep. And one thing that I also remember him talking about was the experience of taking out the execution team for breakfast after completing an execution, how that was a tradition in Florida and they did it routinely, and eventually he put a stop to it. But I'm with you. I think the toll that it takes on the executioners themselves is really incalculable and very much underappreciated. Let's talk a little bit about the state of the death penalty in the United States today. 27 states, according to the Death Penalty Information Center, have a death penalty on the books. The federal death penalty applies in all jurisdictions and territories across the United States. President Biden, as people may have seen, commuted the death sentences of 37 federal death row inmates before leaving the White House. That left 3 remaining on death row. The Trump administration has issued an executive order and a memo by Attorney General Pam Bondi that calls for the enforcement of the death penalty. If you had to, based upon your travels, your research, the various different correctional institutions you've been in, just in your capacity as a close observer of the scene, what's your prediction for 10, 20 years from now in terms of where we go? We're somewhat of an outlier in the world. We don't have very great company in terms of other regimes that enforce the death penalty. Where do you see the trend going, and what's your prediction?
I think it's a really tough question. And Justin, if you had asked me, even a couple years ago, or frankly in the first Trump administration, I would have a different answer than today. And I'll just explain a little bit of context. So in Trump's first term, he executed, I think, 13 individuals on federal death row, which was more people than had been executed in any administration in the prior 60 years. But at the same time, led by Jared Kushner, they, were taking on criminal justice reform. And they were sort of changing their tune a little bit on the crime and punishment kind of mentality. And I wasn't sure whether that would carry on into this administration. I suspected not when they were campaigning. And now, there's been a full reversal, right? Now, everything is crime and punishment. I mean, we're seeing, federalized troops in American cities. It's quite different than the approach they were taking before. And what concerns me about that is that crime has always kind of sold, right? In media, we see it today. Look on the top 10 in Netflix and what podcasts. It's like Americans are obsessed with crime and punishment. And it's an effective political strategy. And I thought that we were moving away from that in the last 5 to 7 years. Even, pro-death penalty Republicans in very big death penalty states like Oklahoma were starting to advocate against the death penalty, right? I mean, that's an extraordinary change. But now I'm not sure. Now I think it's going to take longer than it otherwise would have. So I think that before I would have said, look, we're going state by state and it's slowly being outlawed and it's becoming less politically advantageous to be pro-death penalty. But now that President Trump is asking for, the Justice Department to pursue these cases, that they are pushing for the death penalty in the Luigi Mangione case, for instance, I think that, we might have a reversal. I think it will be kind of 2 steps back, 1 step forward for the next several years. And then I think we'll probably go back to this overall trend of moving away from it. And, I think data hopefully will show us that, being smart on crime is not being weak on crime. It's something that we're seeing in North Dakota and Washington, Oregon, California, where there are more kind of rehabilitative methods being used as opposed to, the sort of like iron fist method of incarceration and corrections. So I guess my long answer short is I think that we are going to move back in time a little bit. But I think by the time we're 10, 20 years ahead, I think state by state, we will start to outlaw it more and more and more. And then I think it will become, much, much less frequently carried out. That's been kind of the trend over time. And I think, in the long term, I think that we'll continue that trend.
Oh, that's really interesting. Let's talk a little bit about before we pivot in about 4 or 5 minutes to Rabbi Breitowitz, I'd like to ask you about the tools of death, the implements of the death penalty. There's a general perception, I think, that lethal injection is somehow more humane, that it's painless, it's sort of, for lack of a better comparison, putting a pet to sleep. Based upon your research and your investigations, what are your views of that? Agree or disagree?
I did very thorough research on this because, this is disputed. And, for obvious reasons, you can't interview, the person on the gurney after they're executed. So we don't know, from a firsthand account what they're feeling during those executions. But as many anesthesiologists and expert witnesses have explained to me in detail, we have come as close as we can come to understanding what those people are experiencing. And I'll try to put this in layman's terms as best I can. But there are anesthesiologists who have witnessed executions, who have reviewed hundreds of autopsies of death row inmates who were executed with lethal injection, and who have years, we're talking 25 years of experience using these drugs in the clinical setting and hearing from patients what those drugs feel like when they enter their body at a much lower dose. I'll give you one example. Potassium chloride is a drug that causes cardiac arrest. It is typically the third drug that's given in an execution in an overdose amount. Well, we know from the clinical setting that when someone feels potassium chloride entering their body, it feels like their body is being lit on fire from the inside, okay? The second thing I would say to note is that when someone is overdosed with a drug, whether it's a recreational drug or in an execution setting, what often happens, and again, we know this from autopsies and from forensic pathologists who study bodies after they have passed, is that one's lungs fill with fluid. So if somebody is conscious while their lungs are filling with fluid, they're suffocating. It feels like they're drowning. The reason that anesthesiologists think that many of those who are executed with these drug protocols are feeling themselves drowning to death is because the first drug that they are receiving is meant to be a sedative, but it's not a strong sedative. It's not general anesthesia like you would get before going into surgery. And so it may cause them to fall asleep. They appear as though they're asleep. Then they get a paralytic, the second drug, which paralyzes their body so they cannot move or show if they're in distress. But a strong stimuli like drowning or feeling your body, feeling like it's on fire from the inside, that is enough to break through that sedative. And that is enough for the body to start to feel that suffering. And so what these folks have said to me is, we have very good reason to believe that these folks, in many cases, are feeling themselves being executed. They are being subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. And of course, that's been their argument in these court cases. But that's just a little bit of the science behind it. I go into detail in the book, but I was convinced. And partly because the expert witnesses on the other side, on the state side, frankly, were just not very convincing with their rebuttals in a lot of these cases. And so I do believe in a lot of these cases that these folks are feeling these drugs hit their body. The very last thing I'll say is that there have been cases where mid-execution, people have said, the death row inmates have said, I feel like my body's on fire. I feel like my body's on fire. So actually, we do have some firsthand accounts of people being able to literally articulate what it feels like with these drugs coming into their body.
Thank you, Gianna. Well, that really was a great sort of table-setting introduction to the death penalty in the United States, and a particularly interesting and troubling morally provocative, I would say, story from Gianna's book. I'd now like to turn to Rabbi Dr. Yitzhak Breitowitz before coming back to having a discussion with you a bit later, Gianna. Rabbi Breitowitz is a senior lecturer at the Or Sameach Yeshiva in Israel. He's a highly regarded lecturer and speaker. He has smicha, rabbinic ordination from Ner Yisrael Rabbinical College in Maryland, and he's a graduate of both Johns Hopkins University and Harvard Law School, where he graduated magna cum laude. Rabbi Breitowitz was also a tenured professor at the University of Maryland Law School. He taught contract law, commercial law, and medical ethics there. Rabbi, welcome to the panel, and I'd love to turn it over to you to share some thoughts, if you could, on the Jewish law perspective, the perspective of Jewish law and ethics regarding punishment, dignity, and the worth of the human being, even for those who commit the most serious crimes, those that society refers to as sort of, quote unquote, the worst of the worst.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, it's an honor to participate in this seminar, although it's a little later in the night for me. And I found Mr. Boney's presentation to be extraordinarily moving, painful, and absolutely heartbreaking as we contemplate the human degradation that is taking place. And I first want to start off with a general Jewish approach on capital punishment, although I understand that that's not the main focus of the proceeding. Anyone who reads the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, will see immediately that there's a death penalty that is administered for a whole variety of offenses, murder, adultery, even religious things like desecration of the Shabbat. And yet we also find in the rabbinic tradition, in the Talmud, that the imposition of the death penalty was extraordinarily rare, based on procedural and evidentiary requirements that could almost never be satisfied. And the great Rabbi Akiva, who actually lived after there was no longer capital punishment practiced in the Jewish legal system, actually said, if he would have been on the Sanhedrin, nobody would ever be executed, because the idea was that this is such an irrevocable type of decision that the rabbinic tradition strongly discouraged the imposition of it. And yet there was a counter-argument that, hey, Rabbi Akiva, if you're going to abolish capital punishment, people will not be deterred from committing these heinous crimes, which means the very debate that we still have to this very day about deterrence versus risk of error, etc., was actually encapsulated in a Talmudic dispute. So in many, many ways, from the classical perspective of halacha, death penalty is on the books, but it was rarely, if ever, applied. However, there is a counter text that we need to consider, and that is, within the Jewish halachic tradition, there is the Torah and Talmud that applies to Jews, but there's also a general societal requirement under what are called the 7 universal Noahide laws. And interestingly enough, under the Noahide code, which would apply to the non-Jewish systems of the world, capital punishment is a bit more freely available. For example, the Noahide code does not require eyewitnesses. It would allow for circumstantial evidence. So in a sense, the Jewish tradition is kind of multi-variable in terms of whether or not capital punishment is a desired punishment or whether we should leave it out. But in connection to what Gianna said, I want to bring up a very, very interesting position. Around 25 years ago, when the state of Illinois was considering whether or not to abolish capital punishment, I actually don't know what the decision was, but there was a very prominent rabbi in Chicago, Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik, a very, very great rabbi, who actually gave testimony in a committee, legislative committee, that Jewish law would be opposed to capital punishment. Now, many of his rabbinic colleagues actually questioned how he could give such testimony, given the fact that certainly under the Noahide Code, capital punishment is absolutely an available punishment for the most serious of crimes. And Rabbi Soloveitchik said that the endorsement of capital punishment of the Noahide Code is limited to a system that's not broken. And when you have a system that, number one, is unfair, that is discriminatory, that's inhumane, that is humiliating and tremendously suffering for people going through it, he says that was never endorsed by any halachic directive. And as a result, he, and I can assure you of his bona fides as an Orthodox rabbi, he actually said that Judaism itself would be opposed to capital punishment under the conditions that it is presently being imposed in the United States of America. I thought that's very, very fascinating because I think it reminds us of Oliver Wendell Holmes' famous dictum that the life of the law is experience, meaning to say, yeah, on the books, in the doctrine, in the black letter, capital punishment is there, but you got to look at the realities of how it's being implemented. So I thought that was actually a confirmation to the point that was made. But the issue that I do want to address, which is the main issue of this conference, is not so much whether capital punishment is justifiable or not justifiable. You know, that is a debate within the Talmud, and then we have the subtle distinctions between the Noachide law and the halachic system. But rather, even assuming that capital punishment is justifiable, you know, does a convicted person of really heinous crimes, and I don't mean to cover these up. Some of these people are absolutely awful, and they've done things that are horrendous by any definition. The question is there still a concept of human dignity? Is there still a concept that people shouldn't be treated a certain way, no matter how bad they might be? Because then, in a sense, we're becoming them. We become them by the way we treat them. And I do want to point out, certainly in the most general sense, human dignity is a cornerstone of Jewish ethical values. And it goes back to Genesis, which talks about man, woman being created in the image of God. And therefore, the often quoted nomenclature, Judeo-Christian ethic, is something I'm willing to go with. And that is, you're in the image of God. That does not mean a physical image, but it refers to dignity, autonomy, respect. You know, our sages make a beautiful observation that God made many cows and many sheep and many donkeys, but only one man and one woman. And part of the lesson is that he who preserves a single life is as if they created a whole world. And he who destroys a single life is as if they destroyed a whole world. So this function of human dignity, which is called kavod habriot, honor, respect for God's creations, is a cornerstone. And let me point out that although there's some textual discussion, are the sages referring only to Jewish lives or non-Jewish lives, all lives? Maimonides makes it very, very, very clear. This is not a parochial idea that's limited to a Jewish life. This is a human value to emulate God's qualities of mercy and compassion. So the question that would arise is whether this applies even to the convicted offender whose life is going to be taken away. And the point that I want to show is that it's very, very clear within the halachic tradition that it does apply even to the convicted criminal. First, the Talmud absolutely prohibits any type of torture in the administration of capital punishment. In fact, the Talmud has a very interesting debate about stoning when a person is thrown off a cliff. Should they be naked or should they be wearing clothes? And the issue actually is, how do you balance two factors? Naked creates a certain shame, and we need to avoid that. On the other hand, clothing might prolong the agony of dying. You know, you'd be quicker when you don't have clothing that block it. So the Talmud actually discusses how do you balance the need to minimize pain with the need to maximize dignity and self-respect. Now, I understand that you can argue that stoning by definition creates difficulties, but putting the particulars aside, the fact that we are talking about a person who is convicted to die and who is going to die, and we are concerned with self-respect, with dignity, and minimization of pain, I think shows us the values of this within the Jewish tradition. And interestingly enough, the verse that is cited as proof, as a proof text, is the verse, love your neighbor as you love yourself, meaning this imperative of love is even extended to the person that we are executing for very, very serious offenses. Now, the theory of capital punishment in the Bible is really three components. There is the idea of deterrence. People should see this awful punishment and be deterred. There is the idea of spiritual atonement. In terms of God's book, the suffering of death effects atonement. And there's more of a metaphysical idea of eradicating evil from society, which is a society like to get rid of the evil. Now, because of the deterrence idea, the Torah actually says that all people that are executed are hung up to be publicly viewed. That's in the last week's Torah reading. But the Torah says you must take down the body before the sun sets. Do not leave the body up. Give it a burial. And the reason that's given is it is a curse or a reproach to God that a human being be disgraced in this certain way. The Talmud actually gives a tremendously graphic example, a mashal to a king that had an identical twin brother, and the twin brother committed an offense, and the twin brother was hung. Anyone who saw the twin brother thought of the king, and that was an insult, and that was a shame. And so too, every human being in the image of God, for a human being to be debased, for a human being to be embarrassed, to be humiliated, even post-mortem, is a reproach to God. We must take him down. And in fact, according to many interpretations, literally, the hanging was not even until sunset. It was literally a minute. 1 minute up, 1 minute down, then must be buried. As Justin remarked, halacha requires speedy execution. The trial can take as long as it takes to establish guilt, innocence, appeals, etc. But once there is a finality of sentence, and again, that could take a long time, and it should take a long time, but once there is finality of sentence, it must be carried out the next day. Now, superficially, that's, you might say, oh, that seems cruel and vindictive. But no, that spares the decades, and it is often decades, the decades of suffering, of anxiety, of every single morning, every single minute of the day, wondering, am I going to die? We want to spare the person that. Once we have determined the truth of the facts, and again, that is a complicated process, we immediately carry it out. That too shows the importance of human dignity in this particular factor. Let me just mention that in respect to other punishments, we see it as well. To give perhaps a bit of a gross example, if a person is getting some type of corporal punishment, which is one of the punishment options, and they begin urinating or defecating in the middle of the procedure, we stop it. The punishment is suspended because the person has suffered a great, great humiliation, and that takes the place of the sentence itself. I'm not directly sure how that might apply in the context of a botched execution, but I think that might lend support to the idea that if something goes wrong, you don't repeat the process over and over and over again, putting a person through those particular pains. So the notion that every human being is entitled to dignity and respect, even if we're going to take their lives, I think it's a very strong idea in the Jewish tradition. And again, as Rav Aaron Soloveitchik did testify in Illinois, that if you have a system that is not going to give the accused or the convicted that type of respect, that is a broken system, and perhaps that may undermine the whole raison d'etre of allowing the capital punishment in the first place. Now, I do want to mention, I really can't, let me give you another teaching that's very, very fascinating. Again, it's not a capital punishment issue, but it shows us an interesting idea. The Torah has various punishments for theft. And in the book of Exodus, there's a bit of a rule that if a man steals a sheep and slaughters it, he must pay the value of the sheep and an additional fine of 3 times. So it's a total of 4 times. If I steal a sheep that is worth $100 and I slaughter it or sell it, my fine is $400, meaning 100 principal and 300 punitive. On the other hand, if I steal an ox, a bull, and I do the same thing, my penalty goes up to 5. So if it's 100, I pay 500. And the Torah does not give any reason for the 4 or the 5, but the Talmud has interesting speculations as to why is there the difference. One reason is that the ox is more valuable, use it for plowing, etc. But another reason it gives is absolutely fascinating. It says the following. It says a sheep is a small animal. It doesn't move very fast. So typically the thief has to carry it through the street. So that's a humiliating experience. Because he suffered the humiliation of having to carry the stolen good, so the Torah gives him less of a punishment because, in a sense, his humiliation was part of his punishment. As opposed to the ox, which he does not have to carry, there's less humiliation. Now, this is extraordinary. I mean, if the guy is humiliated by carrying a sheep, he's humiliated because he stole it. And yet the Torah says, even there, we are concerned for his embarrassment, for his humiliation. Now, of course, obviously, when you're dealing with capital punishment, whether it's just, whether it's fair, whether it's a broken system or not a broken system, whether you can fix it or not, you do have to look at the alternatives, because nobody is arguing, obviously, that these heinous criminals simply be released and sent home. There's going to be a punishment. So almost by definition, you can't really evaluate a capital punishment system without evaluating the prison alternatives that are going to be there. And suffice it to say, there's an awful lot of problems in our prison system as well, in terms of torture, in terms of solitary, in terms of dehumanization, the recidivism rate, the fact that somebody gets into the prison system for minor offenses and will become a major hardened criminal in the very process of serving their sentence. These are matters of major concern. So here I do want to share with you a teaching of the Lubavitcher Rebbe about the Torah's view of a just prison system. Now, in truth, this is not an easy thing to do, because prison is normally not one of the criminal sanctions within the Bible. The Bible does not really speak about prison, but the closest we have to a prison system is the cities of refuge. And the cities of refuge are limited to a very specific context, and they refer to what we would call unintentional homicide, that is roughly equivalent to the concept of manslaughter, where there's there's no intent, there's no malevolent malice aforethought, but there is negligence, carelessness, some type of indifference to life. So the Torah has a very interesting punishment. The person is exiled to a community, and that both serves the purpose of protecting him from the blood avenger, a relative, but also it's an issue of atonement, that even if the person has private security guards, he is not given the option of staying at home. He must go to one of the 6 cities of refuge and remain there. Again, very strange. There's a lot of details I'm not going to be able to explain tonight. It's an indeterminate sentence. He remains there until the death of the high priest. That might be a day later, and it might be 50 years later. And the Talmud indicates that the mothers of the high priest used to bring cookies to the murderers so they shouldn't pray for the death of their son, etc. But Lubavitcher Rebbe made the following observation. The purpose of an imprisonment system, obviously there is protection of the public, but it should primarily serve a rehabilitative function, to give a person hope, to build a person up, to try to steer him away from the mistakes that led to the crimes that he committed. In fact, the old word for prison, penitentiary, which was a Quaker term, I believe, goes back to the notion of penitence. It's a place of reflection, a place where you can turn your life over. So the Rebbe argued, to send a person into an environment which is filled with people who are even worse than he is hardly conducive to a rehabilitative goal. But if you look at the Ir Miklat as kind of a prison, although it's a prison within a city, who lived? There was a permanent population in the Ir Miklat, and they were the Kohanim, the priests, and the Levites. They were the teachers of the Jewish people. They were the righteous people. If a person exhibited a callous disregard for life, you don't put him with rapists and murderers and child molesters. You put him with people who value life, people who are exemplars of morality. And the Rebbe suggested that that needs to be somehow our goal, to try to create within, a dangerous population, within a criminal population, opportunities for growth and rehabilitation and constructive change. Now, that's a big challenge. I cannot say I have the blueprint of how to do that, but that should be the goal of our imprisonment. Because, as I say, you don't really solve that much by getting rid of one broken system and replacing it by another broken system. I think that capital punishment reform has to be in tandem with prison reform generally, and to see what you can do. There was, in Israel, there was a very, very prominent, well-known, respected, and beloved therapist, Shlomo Hoffman, who worked within the religious community. And for many, many years, he's not alive anymore, for many years he was employed by the Israeli prison system to work with criminals. And obviously prisons have rules that if you're a therapist to a dangerous offender, the offender has to be in constraints, right? You're not going to sit with somebody who has strangled people and just let him be not handcuffed. So the standard rule, of course, was and is, in probably every prison system, that at least dangerous offenders have to be under constraints when they're talking to a therapist or the like. Rabbi Hoffman, who's also a rabbi, refused to see people in constraints. He demanded that they be unshackled, and he said, I will take the risk of whatever they do. My therapy is to convince them that they are human beings. They are people. They are children of God. And even when they have committed horrendous offenses for which they must pay, indeed, justice has its demands. But I am there to help salvage the good within them, to help rehabilitate them, to give them hope, and to allow them to turn the rest of their lives into something meaningful and good. And therefore, it is essential that we take off the constraints to communicate to them that you are not a wild animal. You too are a human being that is a child of God, that is deserving of respect. I thought that was very, very beautiful. Now, I do understand that emotionally there are two sides to this. The families of victims, for example, might take it as horrendous that we talk about the dignity of the criminal, and I understand that. I do understand that. But as Gianna said, being smart on crime does not mean being soft on crime. I'm not advocating, and Jewish law does not advocate the notion of actions not having consequences. There are consequences. But at the same time, the notion of all human beings in the image of God means we try to salvage the good when it can exist. Are there cases where there's nothing to salvage? Tragically, there probably are. There probably are. But in most cases, there is something. There is a spark. As the Jewish people know, and maybe even the non-Jewish people know, we're approaching the Jewish New Year very shortly. We're approaching Rosh Hashanah. And according to our tradition, Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment where God looks at all of us and determines, are we deserving of another year of life? Are we deserving to be given an extension? According to our tradition, a preliminary judgment is made on Rosh Hashanah, and it's finalized on Yom Kippur, just 10 days later. So this is a very, very critical part of the year. And in many ways, we come to God and we admit we've made many mistakes. We've done a lot of things wrong. But we ask for another chance. We ask for mercy. We ask that God sees our goodness and not just the negatives within us. And in many, many ways, God responds in mirror image to how we behave towards others. That when we behave towards others and we try to find some redemptive quality within them, God will look at us and find the redemptive qualities within us. So it is a very, very, very difficult challenge, to be sure. But as I say, the Torah is, or the rabbinic tradition, Jewish law as a whole, is emphatic that even when you have to make the ultimate decision of taking a life, and that's really a last resort, you still have to recognize the image of God that is imprinted within every single human being. So thank you, and I hope this kind of covered what I needed to cover.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. There's a question in the chat that relates to the issue of pain, which we've been discussing in both segments of our presentation today. And that is, why is pain even relevant to the discussion? To paraphrase the question. In other words, under the Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which governs these kinds of considerations, the language of the Eighth Amendment is cruel and unusual punishment. And the question is, just because a condemned individual suffers pain, does that rise to the level of unconstitutional, cruel and unusual punishment? I think as a matter of US law, constitutional law, and I may need to be corrected on this, I think that some amount of pain is not unconstitutional. I think the question becomes the degree of pain that the individual suffers, and is it, does it rise to an excessive amount? Gianna, did you want to jump in on that?
Sure, I'd love to. And you're exactly right, Justin. So Supreme Court justices, if we're going to say that there's a partisan divide, which I think is just sort of a realistic outlook on the Supreme Court today. It wasn't always that way. But on both sides of the aisle, justices, have said in clear language that, yes, executions are going to be painful. We know that. But the question is whether they rise to that Eighth Amendment, whether they, are cruel and unusual punishment. And so the Supreme Court has never struck down lethal injection execution. Lower courts have, but appeals courts, federal appeals courts, and the Supreme Court has never determined that method of execution can be considered cruel and unusual punishment and is therefore unconstitutional. So it's really in the eyes of the person that is arguing it or experiencing it. And that's really the crux of the argument is what your question is, Jerome, there is, what is the difference between something being painful and something being cruel and unusual? And so in a lot of these Eighth Amendment cases, what you'll see from defense attorneys and from inmates is that they say, look, if I'm drowning to death, and I can feel it, I'd consider that cruel and unusual punishment. That's not an IV sticking my skin. And so that's really, what's at the center of the debate, and either side, has their own opposing opinions. But I think you've really gotten at the crux of it, and that's something that continues to be argued in the court, at this point, pretty much yearly or every other year.
Rabbi Breitowitz, you mentioned that interesting discussion in the Gemara and the Talmud. And I have a faint recollection of it myself. I'm sure my recollection is not nearly as good as yours is. I don't know whether it's in Masechet Sanhedrin or Makos or where it comes about, but you mentioned this issue of a clothed or an unclothed person who's sentenced to death. To me, that reflects a high degree of sensitivity for even marginal increase in pain. Right? I mean, if we're concerned about whether somebody who's clothed is going to have somewhat prolonged agony through the execution, I mean, that we are orders of magnitude beyond that kind of distinction in the implementation of the U.S. death penalty. But would you agree? I mean, I think that's just a high degree of sensitivity to even a small amount of pain beyond what's being inflicted.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And that's very instructive. And I also want to point out that certainly we find in rabbinic literature the idea that we also get coarsened, and we also get, we lose our moral compass when we become less attuned to the suffering that people are going through. And therefore, the notion of this exquisite sensitivity to even small degrees of pain is not only for the benefit of the person who is suffering, but it's also for our benefit, because we do something to our souls when we become insensitive and we simply don't care. Hey, the guy's going to die anyway, so who cares? If it'll be another minute or another 30 seconds or the like. Because we get affected, we get demeaned, we become different types of people. We don't become the people that we want to become, that God wants us to be. So that's very, very true. Now listen, obviously, all punishment has pain. I mean, going to prison has pain, paying a fine has pain. So nobody could say, either under Jewish law, under constitutional law, that, hey, if there's any pain, the punishment is cruel or unusual. It is a matter of degree. And where you draw the line is not always going to be absolute black letter, but I think it is very, very fair to say that Jewish law has an exquisite sensitivity, which goes way, way beyond the way the present legal systems are set up in the United States.
What you say, Rabbi, about the impact it has on us, not on the condemned, but on society surrounding the condemned, is so interesting. I think it gets back to what Gianna and I were talking about a little bit earlier, about the collateral consequences of the death penalty for the bystanders, right? The execution squad, the family of the victim, the family of the accused, society at large. And on a different note, and we did not review these questions in advance. To be clear, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I am really interested to get your thoughts on a current topic, which is, as everybody is well familiar, Israel has been dealing with an onslaught of terrorism for decades, but particularly since October 7th. And there's been a lot of interesting discussion about the imposition of the death penalty against terrorists. Now, to be clear, we're talking about individuals who are not just being accused, but in many instances have acknowledged, have admitted on their own recordings to having engaged in remarkable acts of inhumanity and savagery. And so there's this discussion in Israel today, where you're living now, Rabbi, and where you've made Aliyah, about the idea of imposing the death penalty on, truly, I think people could agree across the board on the worst of the worst in terms of the heinousness of what's been carried out. Israel has only once imposed a death penalty, and that was on Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi leader who was extradited to Israel. What are your thoughts on Israel, the modern state today, which is not by and large run according to Jewish law, with certain exceptions in the area of personal status and family law, divorce and the like? I know I'm putting you on the spot. I know it's a difficult one, but would be curious if you have any thoughts on that in that context.
Well, again, if capital punishment is justified for anything, it is certainly justified for the brutal terrorism that the Hamas operatives have been guilty of, a terrorism that includes not only murder, but rape, mutilation, child abuse. It is the worst of the worst. So I have no problem. Whether it's efficacious is really another issue, because once again, when you're dealing with ideological terrorism, it's not clear that death penalty acts as a deterrent, especially when they're willing to die in suicide bombings and the like. So I wouldn't say it's absolutely necessary or even helpful, but I don't have any reluctance to impose it. I will say that even here, everything that is said about not doing torture and everything else, I mean, that's going to apply even to the terrorists. A very interesting halachic shaila would be torture in order to obtain ticking bomb information. This is a fascinating halachic debate. Is it justifiable to torture somebody if you're going to get information that could save lives? We can discuss that. That's more of a question. But torture for punitive purposes, I would be against, even in the case of terrorism. But a swift execution of capital punishment does not offend the morality of Jewish law in any way.
Thank you. Gian, I want to ask you if the U.S. System of capital punishment had the sort of procedural safeguards that exist in Jewish law, and we can get into some of those. The need to have two witnesses to the conduct, the need for the accused to actually have been warned in advance of engaging in the conduct. The immediacy of the implementation of the punishment. Would any of that affect your view of the death penalty differently?
So I think that, having witnesses is imperative. Every execution in the U.S., to my knowledge, in modern times has had witnesses. However, states have been very creative with the way that they have excluded some witnesses, including myself, and other folks in media. I'll give you one example. There was a death row inmate in Oklahoma who had asked me to attend his execution. And so I went through the right procedures and all in good faith. And Oklahoma, the Attorney General's office wrote back to me and with not much good reason said that I for some reason could not be a personal, I think they said guest of the death row inmate at his own execution, even though that was allowed for him to make a list. And the reason was because even though it was a personal guest, my profession was journalism. And so I would have to be in that category. But I really just saw that as a way to, exclude somebody who would report on the execution. Would you remind me, Justin, the two other examples you gave in addition to witnesses?
So one is a requirement, and Rabbi Breitowitz will correct me if I'm wrong, that the accused be forewarned before they engage in the conduct that gives rise to a death penalty. So it's not just enough that you have to have two witnesses. Take an example of violating the Sabbath, for example, right? You have to have two people, two qualified witnesses. So that's another whole issue, is the qualification. They have to be adults, not minors. They have to be qualified witnesses. And then aside from that, the accused has to have been forewarned. In other words, told in advance what you are about to do is going to constitute a violation, and make them aware that they could be subject to liable to the death penalty. There's nothing like that we have in the United States, other than in technical tax crimes where there's a high standard of intent called willfulness, right? But in terms of normal homicide, it's intent to kill with malice aforethought in some instances, but no requirement certainly that the accused be warned about what they're about to do in advance.
Putting the mechanics of it aside, because I don't know how we would accomplish that as a society, I'm not sure, because so many of these crimes happened, in a split second. A lot of them are not premeditated. A lot of folks are severely mentally ill, right? They're in a psychotic episode when they commit their crime. Some folks are, in gangs where they're being told by leadership that if you don't kill, then you will be killed. There are so many scenarios where I think it wouldn't be as simple as, someone coming in and saying, hey, if you do this, you're going to get the death penalty. And then they don't do it. Of course, it would work in some situations. But I think what this brings up is a really interesting point, which is that a lot of incarcerated folks who I've interviewed who have life sentences, who committed homicide, were convicted of homicide, in some cases have life sentences, they have said if they were given for instance, therapy sessions or education that they are now getting in prison when they were 12 years old, they would have never committed their crime. If someone had explained to them why they were feeling anger, why they felt the need to be a perpetrator as opposed to a victim, had explained to them how seeing their brother killed in front of them when they were 10 years old, how that would then impact them and make them someone who commits murder. If someone had just sat down with them and helped them understand what they were experiencing and how to prevent those behaviors, they would have never ended up in prison, right? But of course, like many systems in our country, the criminal justice system is very classist and it's very racist. And we do not take into consideration those biases enough to create, adequate programming and access to therapy for young at-risk youth who could benefit from that and whose entire life path could be changed if they understood, why they were moving in that direction.
You raise an interesting issue, Gianna, that we haven't really delved into, and I'd love to do this and get Rabbi Breitowitz's views as well. And that has to do with the juvenile death penalty, which just until 2005, that's only 2 decades ago, was actually constitutional in the United States. The ability to sentence a juvenile to death. Rabbi Breitowitz, I want to ask you the perspective of Jewish law on juvenile punishment and the applicability or non-applicability of capital punishment to juveniles, and then we'll circle back to Gianna to talk a bit more on that.
Yeah, well, putting aside the difficult issue that the age of majority is different under Jewish law. 13 is considered to be halachically the age of majority for a male, bar mitzvah, and 12 for a woman. But ignoring where you draw the line, a minor, anyone that is halachically under the age of adulthood, is halachically not responsible for their actions. So it would be totally inconceivable to put a minor to death under Jewish law or any type of criminal punishment. Now, obviously, if the person is dangerous, steps would have to be taken, hospitalization, institutionalization, whatever it would be, in order to protect the public against a minor that was out of control. But certainly we would not impose capital punishment under those circumstances. There is one particular case in the book of Deuteronomy about a rebellious son who might be put to death even as a minor. But once again, the Talmud imposes so many conditions that indeed it makes the statement that this has never happened and will never happen. So a lot of times, some of the extreme cases are there for pedagogic purposes, illustrative purposes, but they are not meant to be law in action. The law in action is fairly clear that minors are not responsible for their crimes or their torts.
Right. And it's interesting that science, in some ways, is catching up to that ancient view, right? Because we know that the frontal lobe development of juveniles, it takes some time and is as significantly less than it is for people who have reached majority. Critical thinking skills, instant gratification, the ability to plan and think with maturity. Gianna, in your research, have you come across juveniles formerly sentenced to death at all? Have you looked into this?
Yes, and Justin, that you're hitting a point that I was just pondering, which is, advancements in neuroscience have taught us that the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until one is in their mid-20s. So that's impulsive behavior, judgment, all of these things that are, completely and totally central to when minors commit crimes. And so as advancements in that medical science have come along, so has policy. And so, as you said, in 2005, we, outlawed sentencing juveniles to death. However, in line with what I was explaining earlier in the conversation about how we're going backwards a little bit, the GOP legislators just introduced a bill in Congress that would, right now, under federal law, you have to be 16 in order to be charged as an adult in homicide. And so they're now trying to lower that age to 14. And 14 years old is not, you're not even in high school, right? These kids are so young, and it's not to excuse their actions, but I think it's just a reminder to look at, the brain of a 14-year-old, right? You know, what is our responsibility as a government and as a society? Is it to put a 14-year-old who has committed murder behind bars, by the way, where they most likely will not be rehabilitated or given an opportunity at rehabilitation, but rather will be further radicalized and, you know, where they will further be valued higher for the more violence they perpetuate behind bars? Or is our responsibility to give them an opportunity at a different path? You know, even if they are incarcerated for 10 years, allowing them to earn their degree, you know, allowing them to work, allowing them to take an opportunity to take therapy. The impulsivity, I think, is the first point. The second point for me is that young people are more capable of succeeding in rehabilitative environments after committing violence. And so I think we have an incredible opportunity with young people. My hope is that we take that path, as opposed to, you know, the more sort of iron fist, tough on crime path, specifically for people under the age of 18.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Happy to take questions from the audience if there are any. Rabbi Breitowitz and Gianna, if there are any additional comments you guys would like to make before we wrap up shortly. I've really thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Very grateful to you both for your thoughts and insights, but we do have more time.
If I could just add one point, I found the observation that Gianna made that some of the offenders said, had they been given the anger management or the understanding or the awareness of why they feel a certain way, the whole path of their lives might have been different. Is a very sobering thought that we have to take real seriously. That if we start these interventions when kids are young, lives can be transformed. Number one, the victims would be protected. They wouldn't be victimized. And number two, the lives of the offenders can be salvaged. And what a tragedy it is that we're not taking those steps. And as a result, you know, people are dying and the lives of young kids are being ruined forever and ever. So
I couldn't agree more.
I hope we'll find some way to take this seriously.
I can share one story in particular too. I was at San Quentin, which is where California's death row was until it was dismantled last year. And there was a man who had a 30-year plus life sentence for homicide when he was young. And he said that what he learned in the trauma-based therapy that he did not get until he landed at San Quentin, and Governor Newsom has, you know, invested in these programs, is he learned that when and I referenced this a little bit earlier, he witnessed his brother getting shot in front of him when he was young. I think he was 10 years old. And something happened in his brain that said, I will never be a victim the way my brother was. But to not be a victim, I need to be a perpetrator. And so he went on that path of, I'm going to be a perpetrator. I will always be on the offensive. And that's what put him on the path that eventually led to him killing someone over, you know, a senseless drug deal. And so that understanding, right, it's so basic, but something that you could see a child in a gang environment without parents around, without caregivers around, or any mentors could easily not figure out. Right. And it's such a simple thing that with resources could be corrected earlier on.
Yeah, it's incredibly tragic. There's a question in the chat, which is, what does research say about how effective we are at rehabilitating criminals? Or are we just kind of deluding ourselves and thinking that some of the worst of the worst can really be rehabilitated? I'm curious whether either of you have any familiarity with that research. I would just say that through the criminal justice reform movement and the First Step Act, we are going to have access to a pretty rich database of criminal justice reform programming in federal institutions. And so it's hard to prove the counterfactual, what would they have been like but for the treatment that they actually received. But I strongly suspect, consistent with what both of our panelists has been saying, that it can only have a positive impact, not in every single case, but in many, many cases. Gianna, did you want to weigh in?
Sure, I can jump in and Mark, I think this question is so important because this isn't actually about, and the governor of California would say this isn't about, being kind and respectful to prisoners. This is about public safety. And so what the state has found in their data is that if somebody goes through trauma-based therapy programs and educational programs, work programs, and you can look up all this data on the California State website, and they have it year by year and based on which programs, the recidivism rate, so the rate of reoffense, drops. The national recidivism rate in America is around 42%. In California, it's lower and getting lower. So you can see for somebody who did, X amount of trauma programs and X amount of, educational programs, what is their recidivism rate? And it's halved in many cases. I mean, literally drops from 42 to 22. Then you'll see another subsect of people who do different programs, and you'll see that their recidivism rate drops even lower. So the data is showing that these programs work. Are they 100% effective? No. But we can see that the rate of reoffense is dropping. And again, not just 1 or 2 percentage points. We're talking like 10, 20 percentage points. We know that these folks will, in many cases, particularly in California, they will be released back into the public. So the question is, do we want people who have been rehabilitated coming back into society, or people who haven't been, right, who have just been locked in cells, right? I think the former.
Rabbi, that brings us full circle back to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I think, and his intuition that given the dignity of human beings, the fact that they are created b'tselem Elokim, in the likeness of God, we have to have rehabilitation foremost in mind. In our correctional institutions. The purpose is to correct, right?
Yes. The term that many of you are familiar with is the term tshuva, to return to God, to repent, to be rehabilitated. We believe that within every human being there is something good that is salvageable, and our job is to try to salvage it. And that benefits the person, that benefits society as a whole.
Thank you, Robert Bradowitz, and thank you, Justin, for moderating so far. We'll hand it back over to you in a few minutes. But in the meantime, I'd like to just step in and introduce a video interview which was conducted with Rabbi David Goldstein. Rabbi Goldstein is the head rabbi for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He's the chaplain at Richmond State School, the manager of clinic, Harris County Jail, and Federal Correctional Complex in Beaumont. And he gets to experience firsthand the types of people that Gianna, has her book is about, and his role is to provide counseling and guidance for people in such situations. This story, this interview, and this story is going to really speak for itself in terms of the power of the human spirit, despite wrong that a person has committed, and it really illustrates this concept that there's always a spark somewhere of goodness inside every human being. And it's a matter of how we, as human beings, contribute to bringing out and helping to facilitate that spark of goodness to come out. So with that, let me now put on the video.
Religious freedom is a gift God gives us all in this generous country. Even in Jester 3, a prison right outside of Houston, we were meeting up with Rabbi Goldstein, the lead consulting rabbi for the Texas prison system. In short, his job is to make sure that Jews in prison can practice their Judaism.
How are you?
How are you? Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, nice to meet you.
It's Mark.
All is good. I'm a little nervous, to be honest with you.
What are you nervous about?
I don't know. Just nervous.
You never been in prison before?
He told us about his amazing work. However, one story blew our minds.
I call it the bar mitzvah on death row. So I got a phone call that there was a yid on death row, and I hadn't recognized his name. I get a roster of all the Jews in the system. There was a yid that called me, and he told me that about this Jew on death row. He's working for a organization called Project Innocence that are trying to help people get off of death row. So he told me about this yid. His last name was Feldman, and I hadn't heard of him. He wasn't on my roster. But I called his mother, got the information, and yeah, they were Yidden from Dallas. Found out that he had never had a bar mitzvah, and his execution date was looming. It was like a few weeks away. So I made it my thing that the mother had told me two things. That number one, he wants to be cremated, and number two, he never had a bar mitzvah. So those two things became, because
Like your mission.
yeah, b'hashgacha pratis, if that's what I'm told, that means that's what Hashem wants me to deal with.
Wow.
So it was actually a very, very intense situation, because until we were able to secure what's called a person-to-person visit, because in death row, they generally you're through a glass or through wires. But here, I had to explain, I had to actually put on the tefillin.
Right, you had to wrap it
on him. I have to wrap, I have to touch him. So they arranged it, and it was in like the barber shop of the death row.
Were you nervous?
I was nervous because it was like very intense. And you know, they bring him in. He's with chains, chained in his hands, chained in his feet, chained in his stomach, and they sit him down. And I had the other contract rabbi, Mendy, was with me, and for backup, and we were like both sitting there. And I remember his first words to me. First of all, they told me I have 20 to 30 minutes. So I'm like, okay, the clock begins now, you know?
Wow.
So I like to have all this to accomplish in this little bit of time. And the guy really, to me, knocked it out of the ballpark at the beginning. What was it? He said, guys, I'm not really interested in Judaism, and if you're gonna start pushing Judaism at me, we're gonna end the meeting right now. So I'm thinking to myself, oy vey, I'm here, I'm the rabbi.
Trying to wrap him on.
I'm gonna put on tefillin, and
Wow.
what am I gonna do? So, you know, one of my biggest yetzer hara is sports. So I'm like, okay, I'll just talk to him about sports. So he's from Dallas. I grew up in Dallas for part of my life. So I started talking about the Cowboys and all these other things to make him excited. And then I was trying to play mental chess with him. So every once in a while, I'd try sneaking in something, but it wasn't working. And at one point, he got really mad. He banged on the table and says, I told you not to talk about Judaism. I'm like, oh, okay. So one thing is, then all of a sudden I had this light go off. Bing. What was it? His mother had told me that he was pen paling with somebody who was into Kabbalah. But I tried to see what I'm going to do with that. So I said, hey, I heard that you like Kabbalah. Out of the blue, I just told him in the conversation. So he lit up. Kabbalah. I love Kabbalah. So I said, what do you love so much about Kabbalah? He says, I love the Hebrew alphabet. I said, what's your favorite letter? He says, my favorite letter? And I'm here, I'm waiting, a bated breath. What letters? What is he gonna say? What is he gonna say? He goes, my letter? Shimmel. And I looked at him. Shimmel. Did I miss a day of Hebrew school or something? Shimmel. So I said, Shimmel. Shimmel. So I said, Shimmel. So he goes like this. He takes his fingers from his handcuffs, and he goes like this. Shimmel, the shimmel. So I said, the shin. Oh, the shin. That's right, the dreidel, the nun, gimel, hey, shin. I got confused.
All right, wow.
So I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, you like the letter shin. I said, why do you like the letter shin so much? He says, I heard in one of the Kabbalah books, that King David had a shin on his shield. And King David was a warrior. And I'm a warrior. This is what the guy's telling me. So I said, you're a warrior? Like King David? You want to see something cool? He said, yeah. So I unzipped my tefillin. I took out the Shal Rosh. I said, check this out. He said, look at this. He says, that's the letter. I said, exactly. I said, you want to be a warrior? He said, yeah. I said, so let's put these on. Let's put on the tefillin. He looked at me and goes, okay. So I'm like, okay. So I got up, strapped him up, the tefillin, put on the tefillin with him.
That is a crazy story.
And then he started to say Shema, and he broke down crying in the middle of the Shema. And I was like bewildered. I was like going nuts. Like, talk about minakatza, lakatza
wow,
from one extreme to another.
And you like stripped away and went touched in the Shema.
Pink right there. And he started crying. He said the Shema. And we talked about vidui. And we talked about the concept of cremation. And he said, look, Rabbi, honestly, it doesn't mean anything to me. If it's important to you that I shouldn't be cremated, fine.
Wow.
So I'll tell my mother. Okay, fine. So then at the end of that meeting, which was a very intense meeting, it's like, how do you say, first of all, the state gave me 2 hours in the end. It wasn't 30 minutes,
right.
It stretched. I'm like, so how do you end such a visit, right? So I'm like, listen, my friend, Eretz Hashem, one day we'll meet again. I don't know where or when, but Eretz Hashem, we believe Mashiach will come every single day. Should be right now. But I just want to bless you. Chazak v'yamatz, be strong, and Hashem should be with you. Wow. And that's it.
Wow.
So then I ended off.
I'm tearing up. It's crazy.
The end of the conversation was, I said, before I leave, can you do me one favor? She said, what is that? I said, can I give you a hug? He says, well, if it makes you feel better.
Yeah.
I said, it'll make me feel very good. He said, okay, fine. And I gave him a big hug, and we embraced. And we ended the conversation. So the end of the story was, his mother called me, and I was nervous because his mother told me don't bring up the cremation. She didn't want me to bring it up because she
Right,
said,
she don't, right, yeah.
So I'm like,
Cause drama.
so I thought, oh boy, she's gonna give me Musser now because I brought it up, you know. So she's like, Rabbi Goldstein. I was like, yeah, I just want to tell you something. I'm like, oh, I'm starting to sit there. Oh, what did I do now? She says, I just want you to know, my son was on death row for like 8 years, and he was treated like garbage. Could even see it on the videos on YouTube. She says, and the only person who put a loving hand on my son that whole time was you, because you gave him a hug. My son called me and he told me about the hug that you gave him.
Wow.
So now I know you care about him. So I decided I'm gonna sign the custody of his body towards you to do whatever has to happen. And Baruch Hashem, we raised some money in Houston, and in Dallas is where he was buried. That's where his family is from. And so the Chevra Kadisha in Dallas got involved with the JFS there. We made a whole pact, a whole Gans and Isa together, and he was sent away like a year.
Wow. I could cry.
Is that an impactful story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a perfect place, I think, for us to wrap up. As the rabbi referenced, we're in the Jewish month of Elul, coming up on Rosh Hashanah shortly, in a period of judgment for the Jewish people in the world. So this is a timely discussion, as we said at the outset. Really, really greatly appreciate your insightful comments, both of you, and thank you for the opportunity.